Back to the preparing. All right, first thing we're going to do is we're all going to breathe and we're going to relax. The test tomorrow is going to be okay. Or on Wednesday, sorry, Wednesday. So what I'm going to do is a quick lecture to look at the question of why revolution. And this is not directly what the DBQ is, but you should be able to use the information from this lecture to apply to your buckets for the DBQ. The four themes that I want to look at are the same themes we've looked at throughout the entire unit. And the first one is the colonial economy, both the development of the colonial economy and resistance to control of the colonial economy by the colonists. The second one is the fact that there is a growing culture of internal unrest that is going to be capitalized on during the revolutionary period. The third one is that the colonies are establishing an independent and unique American identity combined with increasingly being unified after the French and Indian War and after a few key unifying events. The last one is the idea that the colonies were developing a democratic and republic base that was founded in the principles of republicanism that is going to help facilitate a shift away from the monarchical governance system of the British. Per usual, I will give you just a sample thesis statement. This thesis does not respond to the DBQ that you were given, but it will help you to hear what a multi-part thesis statement might look like. Although there were specific events and characteristics of pre-revolutionary America that were not connected to the revolutionary fervor rising in the nation in the mid-1700s, the political, social, economic, and religious characteristics of the colonies at large contributed to the complex scenario leading to the American Revolution. Certainly, at the micro level, individuals, families, localities, there were events and occasions that had no connection to the overarching causes of the revolution, and the dramatic differences between colonial regions could be considered a hindrance to colonial unity rather than a driving force for revolution. However, from a macro perspective, many of the major events and movements from the 1600s and 1700s contribute to why the revolution happened when it did. Thus, the development of and control of the colonial economy, internal unrest, the creation of a uniquely American identity, American unification, and the establishment of a democratic republic base in the period from 1615 to 1770 created the momentum for the American move towards independence. The first topic to look at about why revolution happens is the development of and control of the colonial economy. Slavery plays a really big role in why the colonial economy is able to develop as rapidly and as successfully as it does. The most important exportable commodity is going to be tobacco for the North American colonies, although sugar is by far the most important product coming out of the British West Indies. The rotations we just talked about Chapter 4, emphasize that significance of sugar as well as tobacco. The area that's going to have the closest ties to the British are going to be the areas that have the most favorable export-import relationship. So you want more exports than you do imports. New England is going to have only about 4.7% exports while importing over 30% of their products. Whereas the South and the middle, or the Chesapeake region, are going to have much, much higher exports due to the raw materials that they are producing. When we think about why the South is the center of loyalist activity, it's very much due to the favorable economic ties. And other than New York, why the New England colonies tend to be more revolutionary, in particular the center of Boston. From the very beginning, the British controlled the colonial economy, from the Navigation Acts as early as the 1660s. But as long as business was good, they practiced salutary neglect. All of this is based off the mercantilist theory that we talked about. In our early rotations on primary sources, you looked at Virginia Resent's restrictions and Adam Smith's balance sheet, which shows how early the colonists were having dialogues that showed that they resented the British colonial control. But in general, as long as salutary neglect was being practiced, the colonists were kept at bay. This shift in policy, or the change in policy, happens arguably after the French and Indian War. Still, the colonies are not as cohesive as we may have imagined them if we think back at just thematically about the Revolution. We tend to think of them as one unified body. They're not. The colony of Georgia is dramatically different than the colony of New York, which is exemplified by the Albany Conference before the French and Indian War, where Ben Franklin even creates the join or die poster, which is the fragmented snake with the names of the different colonies on it. And he uses the Iroquois as an example to say the Iroquois Confederacy, and he says these savages can combine and create cohesion, but yet we as one people, as Englishmen, cannot. And it shows the differences there that really are a challenge to unification during the Revolutionary War. However, the war itself is important because the colonies train together, they fight together, they get supplies, and that's going to be really important. But more importantly is the shift in policy. After the war, there's an increased nationalism because there's a common resentment towards the British for the new policies that are going to be enacted. Everything from the Proclamation of 1763, which is going to prevent the colonists from crossing the line into Indian territory because the Indian Wars were becoming increasingly expensive, to increase in taxes, both internal and external. Internal were ones that they couldn't see, externals were ones that they could see. And to the perception of oppression, especially fueled by a few upper class members of things like the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Intolerable Acts as a whole, the Townshend Act, Quartering Act. All of these are examples of this shift. And the overall reversal of salutary neglect and the enforcement of these laws as Britain needed to pay its pretty expansive debts, due not just to the French and Indian War, but all of the other wars that they were engaged in. So the twofold idea here is that the colonies were developing their independent economy, which they were going to be able to rely on post-war, and there was increased resentment to the control of that colonial economy, especially after the French and Indian War. The second concept is the concept of internal unrest as being part of the American culture. You looked pretty extensively at the Zinn chapter 3, where he talks about the differences between the classes and how that was creating internal unrest. But it was also in some ways, for some groups, the primary basis for settling. Some people came for profit in merchantable commodities and the joint stock companies of Virginia to bring back profit, but others, like the Puritans who came to purify the Church of England and the Pilgrims who came to separate from the Church of England, are coming over to resist the authority and the authority of England and the Church of England. And even within those colonies, you had this strict control of the Puritan communities, but then you had resistance of that strict control by people like Roger Williams and critiques from Anne Hutchinson, who's going to critique the clergymen of the Puritan Society. And then they go to places like Rhode Island and Connecticut because that's where all the bad Puritans go. And so there was enough land that they were able to just separate off, but this became a part of this idea of colonial unrest and what it meant to be American. You also have all these different groups that are settling. Maryland, you had a proprietary colony under the Calverts who were Catholics. Pennsylvania had the Quakers under William Penn. You had Massachusetts Bay, which was primarily Puritan. Plymouth, you had the Pilgrims. You had the southern colonies based in the Church of England. So there's all these tensions that exist, plus the class differences that Zinn was talking about, that create really this boiling pot of unrest. That when the revolution comes along, a lot of that unrest is going to be able to be filtered towards the British. You have all these different groups that are sort of in this period of uprising. Natives versus the colonists, indentured servants like Bacon versus the government and the upper classes. Lower classes than the natives and slaves joining, which was the biggest fear. Natives versus slaves versus colonists, also feared. All these things that Zinn talks about is being harnessed in the fight against the British. It's just a side note, the middle class plays a really important role because they are going to be the buffer zone between the lower classes and the middle classes, and still do today play an important role as a stepping stone so it doesn't create quite as much animosity. If we even think as early as Salem and the witch trials, Salem's representing more so internal unrest than anything about witchcraft. It's one population of people versus another population of people, targeting people that don't fit into the society, the economic differences between the two sides of town, and the power struggle for who is going to really be the dominant belief system. There's a lot of power in the revolutionary rhetoric to pull together this culture of internal unrest into one common piece. All men are created equal. Liberty. That all Americans should have these fundamental rights. And as Zinn would argue, this was masterfully done by the upper classes. But I think it was more so a byproduct of the overall culture that was built. Propaganda is going to be essential to harness this internal unrest. Paine's Common Sense, where he talks about how it's common sense for the colonies to break, and really criticizes the British government and the monarchical system. Revere's Engraving, which the quirky British guy is going to talk about. All of this is part of what it meant to be American, resist things that were unjust, and try to create a new, better society, which they've been doing from the very beginning. The next one is their government system was fundamentally, in some ways, opposed to the British monarchical system. As early as the Mayflower Compact and New England's, the article New England's Theocracy, the primary source that you guys looked at the very beginning, we see how the colonies have to create their own government systems in order to function. But these government systems are going to be fairly progressive. Even the Puritans, as conservative as they were, had a bicameral legislature. All free men could participate in government. They offered education, far more widespread than had been up to this point. Pennsylvania, Penn's frame of government, really important. He believed in protecting civil liberties. They had an elected government, religious freedom, and also friendly negotiations with the natives. That being a little subjective in itself. Although they still recognized the monarchy, these independent ideas helped to fuel, in combination with the Enlightenment influence ideas of Ben Franklin, coming out of John Locke's theory, liberty, life, pursuit of happiness, is going to create the foundation for the founding documents that are going to really distinguish the United States from Britain post-revolution. Schools like Harvard and Yale that were originally formed to teach conservative Puritans in ministry went from training ministers to incorporating Enlightenment ideas. Adam Smith and other intellectuals had a big influence in changing the beliefs of the traditional European society and hierarchy, and given that it was a new nation, had a lot more ability to mold the new generations than it did in the more established areas in Europe. The last piece is the creation of American unification and identity, which is combined with the Democratic Republic base having their own economy, as well as the concept of internal unrest. All of these go into creating what it meant to be American, and it was a really unique thing. Their challenge to unification was their colonial differentiation, which I already talked about. But there were a couple of events that spanned all of the colonies. For example, the Great Awakening. Very famous for the hell speeches of the New Lights, such as Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of the Angry God, where he talks about the spider dangling over the fire, and the fire whipping at the spiders, like great stuff. Again, if you have extra time on your hands, feel free to read a whole selection of those. And even though within the Great Awakening you had these different groups, the Old Lights who wanted to maintain Puritan values, the New Lights who had new ideas, the hell speeches, the Old Lights thought the New Lights were heretics, the New Lights and the Old Lights thought the Arminians were heretics, the Arminians are going to believe in the new Enlightenment ideas and rational action. The Halfway Covenant, probably my favorite, where they needed more church membership, so they let the little guys come in halfway and without really having a full conversion experience. But the New Lights are going to create new leadership opportunities. More than just the hell speeches, this is going to be a new way of articulating ideas, impassioned public speaking. Even slaves are going to be pulled into this religious revival. So it's going to create more cohesion and a shared experience in the colonies. Literature as well, such as Poor Richard's Almanac by Ben Franklin, is going to be really important in the cohesion of the Americas. Letters from an American Farmer, which you read with Crevecoeur's ideas about what it meant to be American, this melting pot of people. The French and Indian War, they fought together, they won together, then they were limited together for post-war expansion. British resentment, just the common enemy suppressing liberty, equality, opportunity, economy, that's very unifying. As Payne will talk about in Common Sense, the basic separation, an island trying to rule a continent, and in all of its absurdity, is going to create its own identity. This idea of internal unrest, why people are coming, the promise of the American dream, which happens from very, very early on, independent governance systems, combined with the powerful propaganda of the revolution, which is key. The quirky British guy is going to talk a lot about that. But even with this identity and unification, there's a challenge. And the challenge is the very separate identities of each colonies. And even though a lot of unification comes during the Revolutionary War, Washington in the first administration is going to still be dealing with the challenges of the different colonial identities and different goals. And we see that all the way up into the Civil War period. And then post-Civil War, it kind of dissipates a little bit because Lincoln masterfully uses the opportunity of the South not being a part of the United States to just pass everything else. The American dream looks different for everyone, but these factors, these very early factors, are creating the foundation for an identity that is very unique to American, and it all kind of filters into the revolutionary spirit. The end.